Unit 5, Social Psychology. Presentation 3, Obedience to Authority.
When faced with a direct order from someone in authority, an individual must decide whether to obey or not. Despite this element of choice, however, it appears that many human beings find it hard to resist doing as they are told, even if it means going against their own conscience and doing something they know to be wrong. Much of the work carried out by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s was to determine the specific situational factors that caused people to carry out the will of a powerful authority figure.
Much of the impetus for Milgram's work came from the war trials carried out after the Second World War. Many Nazi war criminals defended their role in mass murder by claiming they had been only obeying orders. Therefore, they could not be held personally responsible for their actions. Throughout his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, Adolf Eichmann, the mastermind behind the deportation and murder of millions of Jews between 1942 and 1945, persistently stated that he was only following orders. Watching his trial, philosopher Hannah Arendt concluded that he was just an ordinary guy, with nothing strikingly evil about him. It was in the light of revelations from Eichmann's trial that apparently ordinary people could carry out extraordinary acts in the name of obedience that Stanley Milgram began his now famous study of obedience.
Milgram's study of obedience. Milgram was interested in how apparently ordinary people could somehow be coerced into carrying out such destructive acts. To investigate this, he carried out a laboratory study using 40 male volunteers, recruited from a variety of different trades and professions in response to a newspaper advert.
By drawing his sample from the working population, he hoped to obtain a good cross-section of ordinary people for his research.
They believed they were to take part in a study on the effect of punishment on learning. When each participant arrived at the lab, he met another participant, introduced as Mr. Wallace, who was actually a confederate of the experimenter. After drawing lots, the real participant was assigned the role of teacher, and the confederate that of the learner. The teacher's job was to administrate a learning task and deliver electric shocks whenever the learner got a question wrong.
The real participants thought they were delivering electric shocks, but actually none were being given. Another important point is that the teacher began with 15 volts and then, for subsequent errors on the part of the learner, had to increase the shock level in 15-volt increments up to a maximum of 450 volts.
In Milgram's study, the learner was in a different room. The teacher gave a shock each time the learner made a mistake, increasing this by 15 volts each time a mistake was made. At the point when the teacher delivered a 150-volt shock, the confederate was instructed to cry out. At this point, most participants turned to the experimenter to find out how to proceed. The experimenter told the participant to treat no answer as a wrong answer and to carry on. From that point until the 330-volt shock level, the learner yelled in pain and demanded to be released after each shock.
Despite the protestations of the learner, 26 of the 40 participants continued all the way to the 450-volt level of shock. That means that 14 participants stopped before pressing the 450-volt switch. One of these participants stopped prior to the 150-volt level, and 6 stopped after hearing the learner's protests at 150 volts. Therefore, although a total of 35% defied the experimenter before delivering the final 450-volt shock, a massive 65% of participants were completely obedient right to the end.
Milgram carried out 18 variations of this study, each time varying some aspect of the situation to see what difference this made to the level of obedience. In order to test whether being able to see the learner made a difference to obedience levels, in the proximity condition, the learner sat in the same room as the teacher. Obedience levels dropped to 40%, with only 16 of the participants going to the full 450 volts.
Other variations investigated how the proximity of the authority figure affected obedience. When the experimenter left the laboratory and gave his orders over the telephone, more of the participants felt able to defy his orders. In this condition, the level of obedience dropped to 21%.
In the two peers rebel condition, the participant was joined by two confederates. They shared the responsibilities of administering the learning test and delivering the shocks. When these confederates refused to continue, almost all the real participants also withdrew, with only 10% continuing to the full 450 volts.
Evaluation of research into obedience. Despite its significant scientific value, Milgram's research raises important ethical issues. Milgram's obedience studies generated a great deal of discussion because of the ethical issues that they raised. Critics such as Diana Baumrind argued that the short-term stress and potential long-term harm to participants could not be justified.
In his defence, Milgram provided evidence that showed the vast majority of his participants were not only glad they had participated in the study, but also claimed they had learned something important as a result. Other critics have focused on the issue of deception and the lack of informed consent. Participants were recruited believing they were taking part in a study of the effects of punishment on learning rather than a study of obedience. As a result, they were denied the right to give their informed consent.
A recent replication suggests that Milgram's findings still have relevance today. American psychologist Jerry Berger noted that nearly 4 out of 5 of the participants who continued past 150 volts went all the way to the 450 volt level. The 150 volt switch, therefore, represented something of a point of no return for most participants. Berger carried out a replication in 2006 that allowed for a comparison with Milgram's original study, but without the same ethical problems. For example, participants were carefully screened and their right to withdraw was emphasised throughout. As with Milgram's study, participants were recruited through advertisements in local newspapers and through flyers distributed at libraries, coffee shops and community centres.
70 adults took part in the study, delivering shocks up to the point at which they first heard the learners protest at 150 volts. Obedience rates in this replication were only slightly lower than those found by Milgram, showing that the pressures to obey, identified by Milgram 45 years earlier, are still as relevant today.
Milgram's view that the behaviour of Nazi war criminals could be a consequence of obedience is not supported by other evidence. David Mandel argues that Milgram's conclusions about obedience being an important causal factor in the Holocaust is not borne out by analysis of actual events. Mandel quotes historian Christopher Browning's study of the actions of Reserve Police Battalion 101 to support this claim. This group of men was part of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads used to kill Jews by shooting prior to the days of the gas chambers.
For these men, situational factors such as physical proximity to their victims or an absent authority figure made no difference to their levels of obedience, something that directly challenges what Milgram had discovered in his laboratory. As a result, Mandel claims that Milgram's research offers little more than an excuse, or to use his words, an alibi, for the behaviour of war criminals.
What can we conclude from our study of obedience? Milgram's research revealed some startling, unexpected findings. Prior to this study, not even Milgram believed that any of the participants would administer the maximum shock, yet the majority did just that. His studies emphasised the profound effect that situational forces can have on behaviour, rather than simply attributing a person's behaviour to his or her character.
Whatever happened to Adolf Eichmann then?
After a lengthy trial, his only obeying orders defence was rejected by the court in Jerusalem, and he was executed shortly before midnight on May the 31st, 1962, just 4 days after Milgram had concluded his obedience studies.